Okay, this is a supplement to what we covered on today, Monday of week 4. Since we're a little bit behind because of snow days and things like that, and a shorter class today, I'll just kind of, a lot of you missed what was going on today, so I'll kind of review a little bit and then also talk about a few other things. Okay, well, if you listen to the audio of today's lecture, we talked a little bit more about survey. We covered things that one could look for on the ground in order to discover archaeological sites. Like you can see here, disturbances in the vegetation caused by walls buried underneath. This view right here at the surface shows you that there's no difference in the elevation here. And so it's not like the walls are sticking up above the ground, but they are interfering with the growth of the vegetation here, and that shows up in an aerial photograph. That's one way to discover archaeological sites. We also talked about previously walking transects and finding pottery in plowed fields. Talked a little bit about today about Google Earth and also satellite photos as well, which we mentioned last time. Also, figuring out what's underneath the ground and archaeological site using techniques such as ground penetrating radar. Similar technique uses electricity or magnetometry to do the same thing. We also talked a little bit about survey and sample strategies because you can't dig everywhere within the region. You have to try to sample, and we looked at several sampling techniques. The lab uh, explores random sampling and also allows you to create your own sampling strategy to see which one is more effective. A lot of people, when they did the lab today, chose a non-probabilistic sampling strategy. That is, they chose to dig where they thought sites would be based on features on the landscape. Right, and you can see that here. Drawback with this strategy, as was said before, is that you're not getting a full coverage of the region. Therefore, you can't say that people are not living in this area because you never sampled there. So it's sort of an incomplete sample, but you only get what you think are archaeological sites. The other strategy we talked about was simple random sampling, right, where the units are chosen completely randomly. Um, the problem here, obviously, is that you have clusters. So you can see a cluster down here. You don't have an even spread of units. That's one major problem. So in order to deal with that, some archaeologists do a stratified random sampling. That is, they stratify the sample based on, it could be several criteria. And in this case, it's hill country versus valley, right? You can see the valley is bigger than the hills. The hills are about 2/5 the area. The valley is about 3/5. So 2/5 of your number of sample units will be here, and 3/5 of the number of your total sample units will be down here. That's stratified random sampling. To try to get kind of coverage like almost like a mesh, you might do systematic sampling where you're, let's say, doing every other row or every 10th unit, right? So you see you can get more of an even coverage that way. Drawback there is you still may miss things if people built cities, roads, etc., in a systematic way as well. So the way to deal with that is to do what's known as a stratified systematic. And what you're doing is you are basically dividing up the entire region into several large units, like so, right? And then what you do within each of these larger units is you randomly sample. So you randomly sample in this area, then you randomly sample here, then you randomly sample here. So you still have an element of randomness, but the randomness is spread out more systematically. Okay, so settlement archaeology. When you're surveying, again, you're not just trying to find sites. That's only one part of it. You're also trying to get a regional picture of the civilization. You're trying to figure out what was going on in the entire region. You're also trying to determine where people were not living. So you get kind of a complete view of what was going on. And so we're going to look a little bit at that. Okay, so you might find different size sites. A regional center like a city, maybe a smaller city, a village around the city, a village off in the countryside, and then a very, very tiny village. Okay, so I'll give you an example of what some of these settlement patterns can tell us. A survey in Iraq in the 60s and 70s was focusing on the time period of right before the emergence of civilization in Mesopotamia, so southern Iraq here, and the period of the development of civilization, right? This is a period called the Uruk period. So this is the early middle Uruk period, and this is the later Uruk period, right? And so these guys surveyed sites all over, up and down this area in southern Iraq, and they located sites, figured out what time period they were from, and then also showed the size of the sites here. Right. Now you can see a number of things when you look at the map very, very closely. When you look at it really closely, the obvious thing that changes is there's more settlement up here than down here early on, and it shifts. Right. So you have more settlements here than you do here in that northern section. Okay, that's just one change. What also is happening is you can see all of these small sites, right? Small sites, small sites, small sites. The number of small sites shrinks, right? So the number of small sites is fewer here, but sites, you can see here, are actually increasing in size, right? So what is going on is the smaller sites are being abandoned and people are migrating into the larger sites. And based on what the survey, it looks like the population actually decreases a little bit from the early to the late period. So what this shows us is during the emergence of civilization, the population was not increasing. The change that was going on was the migration of people into the cities from the countryside. Right? So that's just an example of how settlements, survey of settlements can be used to actually look at an archaeological question even before you start to excavate. Okay, so all in all, and we're going to go over this later on, which survey and sampling strategy you identify a research problem. So your research problem might be identifying the earliest chiefdoms in the region. You apply for a grant, you conduct a survey, excavation of, let's say, a site, and then the final analysis. We're going to talk a little bit about ethnoarchaeology and experimental archaeology. Experimental archaeology is essentially replication, trying to replicate tools and artifacts in order to see how they were used or to see what kinds of marks they made in ancient times. So this is kind of sad, but this was not the archaeologist who did it. This was an elephant who died, natural causes. Archaeologists moved in and used replicas of ancient tools to butcher the elephant in the way that Homo erectus would have done. And what they were trying to do is to test the efficacy of different tools for different functions. Right, and you can see here, some of these stone tools were quite effective. So that's one aspect of experimental archaeology. Experimental archaeology also tries to show or demonstrate the way ancient people could have performed things, such as the raising of the Maoi in Easter Island. These stone sculptures you can see here. Okay? You look around, there aren't any trees here at all. And one of the alien archaeologists, Eric von Däniken, said, well, this shows it had to be aliens who put these in place because there's no way people could have done it because there's no trees there. Well, what Eric von Däniken didn't take into account is that there used to be trees on Easter Island, right? That is, many of the people on Easter Island actually cut those trees down. So there are none today, but there actually were in ancient times. So this goes along sort of with the idea of Occam's razor. Occam's razor is essentially if there are two explanations, the simplest one is probably the best, right? So that is if you have two explanations. One explanation is that extraterrestrials from another planet came down and helped these people build their stone sculptures. Right? That's the more complex one because you're assuming something that doesn't really have a lot of evidence, and you're sort of using that lack of evidence, the lack of evidence of people building it, to prove aliens, right? Or that people built these things and you just kind of have to figure out how they could have done it. That's the simpler explanation. So how do you do that? Well, you do tests, right? You try to replicate things. And you figure out how possibly they could have done it. So this is archaeologist Johan van Tilburg created one of these Maoi out of concrete, and with several people demonstrated that using rollers and using this sort of leverage system, you could put the Maoi in place. But there are other hypotheses. One is that these things stood upright and there were ropes attached on either side, and people rocked these statues back and forth, and they slowly walked, right, in quotation marks, walked across the land until where they finally rested. That's another possible method. Okay, another famous, not quite experimental archaeology test, but something that people actually know a little bit about is the Voyage of the Kon-Tiki, which actually was made into a movie recently. I forgot exactly what the name of the movie is, but it's about the famous Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl. Thor Heyerdahl, very interesting character. You can see his trip was in 1947. In World War II, he was fought with Norwegian partisans against the Nazis. Actually fought on skis as part of this partisan unit. Very interested in anthropology. Saw that there were potatoes in South America, and there were similar type plants in the South Pacific. So he came up with the hypothesis that the South Pacific Islands were colonized by people from South America. Right? People didn't believe that, or they couldn't accept that ancient people could have done that voyage, that kind of lengthy voyage across the Pacific. So Thor Heyerdahl decided that he was going to build a replica boat and sailed across that way from South America all the way to a Pacific island. And this is not the actual boat he sailed in. The actual boat was larger, right? And you can see it right here. And so he sailed on it with some of his buddies. They made it all the way across. It was a pretty incredible trip. And what did he show from that? Did he show that people from South America did actually colonize the Pacific Islands? No. He showed that they could have. But it turns out that from the archaeology we know that that's not actually what happened. That's people from the South Pacific who were already there, who actually migrated from Southeast Asia, traveled to South America, where they encountered people there and also discovered things like the potato, and then they actually brought that back with them. So there was no colonization from South America to the South Pacific. But what he did show is that such a kind of journey was possible. Okay, there are other experiments that have been done, such as experiments on ancient pits, Iron Age pits in England. How much grain could those pits hold? Well, the best way to find out was to actually build one of these pits and fill it up and figure out how much could actually fit in there. Mummification was something that some archaeologists wanted to replicate to see what the process was like. And so this was a body of an individual donated their body to science once they passed away. And an Egyptologist by the name of Bob Breer replicated from papyri scrolls and other things, the process of mummification. And so here you can see the body covered in natron salt. It's a naturally occurring salt that removes any moisture from the body and produces a natural mummy. What they found from the replication is that it had to be 40 days. Any less and it really didn't work. They also found out that the skin reacted with the natron salt and produced a very black color to the skin. Right? So Egyptians were, uh, darker than people from Southwest Asia, from Mesopotamia. Right? It's hard to reconstruct exactly what their skin color was, but certainly it was a brown skin color, but not a jet black. It turned jet black as a chemical reaction with the natron salt. And this is something I've actually done with baking soda. Baking soda is similar to natron salt. If you take a piece of leather and put it in a solution of natron salt, you'll see that it shrivels up, becomes very, very hard, and also turns a black color. Okay, so that's another series of experimental archaeology reconstructions. And one we're going to do when it warms up, obviously, is working on the atlatl. So we'll do some more of that when it gets warmer and actually look at how the atlatl was used. All right, ethnoarchaeology is a little bit different. Ethnoarchaeology is where you're looking at modern human populations, right, either in the recent past or living today, in order to understand ancient societies, right? So that is, if you want to look at the patterning of garbage of an ancient hunter and gatherer site, you try to find a modern example that is as close as you can get to the ancient culture, right? So hunters and gatherers today, and study their trash, study their behavior, study their living patterns in order to look at some of these ancient cultures. Right, so we're going to look at just a couple of examples of this. All right. One in the Near East is looking at ethnoarchaeology to understand how tells form and how they should be excavated properly. Right, so as we said before, tells are human-made mounds. The accumulation of debris over hundreds or thousands of years, you end up with this unnaturally shaped mound over here. Right, okay, well, you go to a village today in many parts of the Middle East, what you're going to see are homes made out of mud bricks. Right, so here you can see some mud bricks lying right there. They basically, dig out some earth, mix it with water, that makes mud, and then they put it into molds. Remove the bricks, they dry in the sun, and then you can start building. Right, so the best houses usually have a stone foundation that prevents water from the soil from seeping up into the bricks and destroying the house, but you can build a house with just a mud brick foundation like you can see here. So there's some bricks drying, they have them ready, there's some chaff over there, a little kid sucking his thumb, right? So they're ready to build a house. These houses in the Near East could get big. So here's a typical Syrian village in the northern part of Syria. So you could see they would use their roofs for activities. Some of these houses could be multi-story high. An amazing example is in Yemen, where the mud brick structures can actually be 6 or 7 stories tall, almost look like apartment buildings. And these are all made out of mud brick. This is, I think, a World Heritage Site, but they continue to repair the mud brick buildings, and so you can see they've lasted. Right, and this gives you another close-up. This is again in Yemen. You can see this is all completely made out of mud brick. All right, so here's that Syrian village again. Right, you can see not a lot of trees there, but there's dirt, a little water, and again you got mud. Okay, so how are one of these houses built? Well, we'll look at that and see what they can tell us about how to excavate a tell. Okay, this is what the top of one of these houses looks like, and archaeologists have long wondered what these stone things they found in archaeological sites were. Turns out that they are placed on roofs, and when there's a rain, they are rolled along the roof to tamp down the roof again, to prevent the roof from eroding. Okay, Now, one of the things archaeologists have also learned is that you can see here they're digging out some of the earth to make bricks. Well, sometimes people use the tell that they're living near as a source for their earth, right? So as they will actually dig into the tell and make bricks from the earth from the tell. And so what happens is artifacts from the tell end up in the actual bricks themselves, right? So they can build a structure that dates to uh, 2011 or 2014, right? But within the bricks are artifacts from 3000 BC, let's say, right? So this is something related to context that we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. Okay, so here they have the outline of the house, and they're going to start laying the bricks using mud as essentially a mortar. You can see here, right? So they're getting higher and higher, building different rooms. Uh, Wood is rare, as we said before. Wood is rare, so they only use wood for certain pieces that they have to use it for, such as lintels over windows, like here. But again, there's not a lot of it, so they have to be careful in how they use it. Also for roof beams is what they use it for as well. See, the buildings get a little higher. Now they're ready to build the roof. So they bring up the roof beams and lay them across. And they pile on some straw left over from the harvest of the wheat or the barley. You can see there, preparing it. There's the roof with some straw on top. And then they put, you can see in there, they put a cap of mud on top of that and some mud on the outside of the house. And you have a finished house there. So these houses, if they're maintained, will last maybe 50 years or so, if you're lucky. But eventually they start to break down. What usually happens is the roof goes first because rodents or scorpions make their nest in the roofs. And then pretty much the house is uninhabitable. You have to just let the roof collapse and basically abandon that house. But while you're living in the house, areas outside the house are used for activities, are used for preparing food. So this is an oven you can see over here, right? And so this courtyard area is very, very useful. And that's something archaeologists have to take into account when they're excavating sites in the Near East. Right, so here's another oven. This is a bread oven. They light a fire inside. They take the dough. They place the dough on the inside surface over here. It bakes, and they remove it like so. The ladder up here because, again, the roof is used for a lot of different activities as well. This is another view of the oven. And so this is the village. Narrow streets, kids wandering around. So what happens when the house is abandoned? Well, recycling is the first thing that happens. And what do they recycle? The wood. Again, because there's not a lot of it, you pull the roof timbers off and you reuse them. Right? That's one of the first things that gets recycled. So the roof is gone, it caves in, and everything that is left on the floor that's buried by the roof is in its original position in the way it was used. That's a very important thing to remember. Now the room is essentially the building is abandoned. What do people use it for? They use it for a trash dump. So they start to throw in their trash. Bricks from the walls break off and fall in there as well. You have more and more erosion, right? And so walls start to topple in, as you can kind of see there, right? Until you get a big sort of pile of rubble, right? So you can still see pieces of the walls. And then you have this pile of collapsed bricks over here, right? Now, what does this tell us? It tells us that the best way to excavate this site is to start digging down. That is, if you are digging and you see loose bricks and garbage mixed in, you know you're in the kind of debris that comes after a house is abandoned. Then you might get to the roof. When you get to the roof, you know that things underneath the roof are going to be in their context in which they were originally used. And so you'll dig much more slowly and carefully, right? And so this tells us sort of how to dig a tell properly, right? Again, here are some other pictures of tells, and you can see just how noticeable they are on the landscape, right? This is completely flat, and then there's this huge flat top mound sticking up out of nowhere. Okay. So what we'll cover on Wednesday is looking at another example of ethnoarchaeology, and we'll look at a classic case of um, the Inuit and the Southwest United States. So we'll stop here for today. I'll post this on YouTube so you can watch it. You're probably watching it right now if you hear my voice. And I'll see you on Wednesday.